Andrew Murray talking about potential for charges after the Charlotte police shooting of about a few months ago. Just drop in here real quick.
When the investigation is complete and the law enforcement agency has turned over its investigative file, the case is presented to my homicide team, which analyzes evidence piece by piece and considers how state law would apply to the case. Then the group makes a recommendation to me as to whether or not charges should be sought. In the final step, I personally and thoroughly reviewed the entire file. I can tell you that in this case, I felt it was important enough to have additional senior attorneys weigh in. So my executive team and my previous homicide team members joined the present homicide team for this review, bringing together a group of about 15 career prosecutors. Their recommendation was unanimous. That bears repeating. 15 career prosecutors, and their recommendation was unanimous. The laws that must be considered in these cases revolve around self-defense. Under state law, an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm allows someone to respond in such a way as to negate or stop the threat. The same legal standards apply to both private citizens and police officers. The only difference is that by the nature of the work they are asked to do on behalf of the community, police are sometimes required to run toward rather than run away from dangerous situations in order to protect the public. Several federal civil court rulings are instructive in cases of officer-involved shootings. Essentially, the law says we have to determine whether it was reasonable for the officer to believe he needed to use deadly force. The U.S. Supreme Court found that this reasonableness must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 vision of hindsight. And that this reasonableness must allow for the fact that police are often forced to make split-second decisions in rapidly evolving situations. The courts also say that the Constitution does not require police officers to wait until a subject shoots to confirm that a serious threat of harm exists. I'm now going to discuss the timeline events and the provable facts. On September 20th, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department officers Vincent and Sergeant Pendergraft were conducting surveillance at an apartment complex off Old Concord Road to locate a person who is not related to this case. Officer Vincent parked his unmarked van in the complex parking lot with Sergeant Pendergraft concealed in the back. Because both were working undercover, they were in plain clothes. Basically, the officers in a van pull nose forward into a visitor spot. Sergeant Pendergraft is in the back, hidden with tinted windows. Officer Vincent is driving. While conducting this surveillance, Mr. Scott parked his white SUV close to the van. Officer Vincent saw Mr. Scott exit the SUV and walk past the van. Officer Vincent said it appeared as though he was trying to look into the van's tinted windows. At that point, Officer Vincent was concerned that their cover may have been blown, but Mr. Scott got back into his SUV and drove away. The officers remained in the unmarked van. We now know at this point, Mr. Scott went to a nearby convenience store. Investigators later discovered a time-stamped receipt in his SUV that led them to the store, where they found surveillance footage showing that Mr. Scott parked outside and then entered the store. I'm about to show you a video of Mr. Scott parking directly in front of the store and then stepping and walking into the store. I'm going to call your attention to his right ankle as he goes to close the door that does not close immediately. Again, I can't find the slide. Oh. So this is Mr. Scott pulling up in his white SUV. He gets out. The door doesn't already close. Please watch his right ankle as he turns to close his door, which will be on the right side of the screen. There. That's an isolated picture of that scene. The bulge you can see here is consistent with the holster and gun that was later described by officers and located at the scene. Within minutes, Mr. Scott returned to the apartment complex where he parked beside Officer Vinson's van. When he parked beside the vehicle, he backed in. So you have the police officer nosed in, you have him backing in with their driver's side doors close to each other. At that time, Mr. Scott opens his door, leans to the side, empties a cigarillo. For those of you who do not know what a cigarillo is, it's just a small cigar, empties it and begins to put in marijuana from a pill bottle and roll it. The pill bottle of marijuana blunt because it was smoked when it was later located, were recovered at the scene. At this time, the officers decided the marijuana did not warrant an interruption of their surveillance operation. Officer Vinson told investigators, and I quote, "We're not really worried about a little marijuana." That all changed when Officer Vinson saw Mr. Scott holding up a semi-automatic handgun as he sat in his vehicle. Officer Vinson told Sergeant Pendergraft what he had seen, and they decided to leave and come back with marked cars to make an arrest for the marijuana and further investigate the firearm. These observations are corroborated by both officer statements as well as a radio traffic in which Sergeant Pendergraft asked other officers to join them because they'd seen a man with drugs and a gun. I'm going to play you that radio traffic. And then hit the button. Okay. It's here instead of on. There. There it is. Your mouse is just there. This radio traffic is important because it corroborates the fact that officers saw Mr. Scott with a gun before any action was taken. Officer Vinson and Sergeant Pendergraft met nearby with Officer Miranda and Wiggins. They decided to return to the parking lot with their undercover vehicles, and they instructed Officer Hostetler to join them at the scene with a marked patrol vehicle. Officers Vinson, Miranda, Wiggins, and Sergeant Pendergraft were wearing plain clothes, and all four put on tactical vests. Officer Vinson's vest had his badge clearly displayed on the chest. The others had vests with the words police in bold letter completely across the chest. Officer Hostetler was in the marked unit and wore a typical police uniform. The officers had decided that Officer Vinson would use his unmarked van to pin Mr. Scott's vehicle into the parking space so that the SUV could not be driven away. After Officer Vinson parked his van in this manner, Officer Miranda, who was wearing a tactical vest as previously described, approached the passenger side of Mr. Scott's SUV. It was at this point that Officer Miranda says that he saw Mr. Scott reach for his ankle holster. Officer Miranda saw the butt of the gun sticking out of the holster. he yells, "Gun, gun," to his fellow officers. In his interview with investigators, Officer Miranda said that Mr. Scott looked at him and then pulled the gun out of the ankle holster. Officer Miranda began yelling, "Drop the gun, drop the gun." Officer Hostetler, he's the officer in uniform, ran to the SUV, in the regular uniform, ran to the SUV and tried to break the passenger side window with a baton. As he did this, he reported seeing Mr. Scott holding a gun in his right hand as he was seated in the SUV. After Officer Hostetler broke the window, Officer Miranda said he saw Mr. Scott take a deep breath and exit the SUV. Officers Vincent, Hostetler, Wiggins, and Sergeant Pendergraft all saw the gun in Mr. Scott's hand after exiting the vehicle. However, as everyone here is aware, none of the video recordings, the dash cam, the body-worn camera, or Mrs. Scott's cell phone video clearly capture Mr. Scott's hands. What is clearly captured on video is Mr. Scott's right ankle. When he exits the SUV, you can see that his right pant leg is pulled up above the ankle. This is the same spot where you can see a bulge in his pant leg in the convenience store surveillance footage, and the same place on his ankle where police recovered a holster following the shooting. Here, the bulge, the protrusion. Here, the ankle goes along with Officer Miranda, who indicated he reached down, pulled it out. You see what appears to be a holster, and nothing to the left and right. Here you have a huge bulge. Also captured on all videos are the repeated commands from officers for Mr. Scott to drop the gun. Based on the dash cam video footage and Mrs. Scott's video, officers can be heard at least 10 times commanding Mr. Scott to drop the gun. The videos also show that Mr. Scott did not comply with those commands. In interviews, officers described Mr. Scott's behavior during this incident. Those descriptions included that he had a blank stare, as if he was in a trance-like state. This behavior is consistent with the known side effects of medication prescribed to Mr. Scott. Additional side effects are aggression and behavior abnormalities. I'm going to show you a picture of Officer Vincent and where he was in proximity to Mr. Scott when he exited the vehicle. This is from the body-worn camera of Officer Hostetler, who had broken a window. Officer Vincent here, just in what I will call the V, the white SUV of Mr. Scott, the police van that comes up in pins, Mr. Scott here, in close proximity across the car. There's been some speculation in the community. Oh, I'm sorry. I missed the slide. Officer Vincent could see that Mr. Scott continued to not comply with the officer's commands, and in his interview, he described the moment that he perceived that Mr. Scott posed an imminent threat. Mr. Scott looked at Vincent, then looked in the direction of each officer, and then looked back at Vincent. I'm going to play for you Officer Vincent's interview, this portion. So at this point, I'm going to take you through Officer Vinson did not know Mr. Scott. None of the officers knew Mr. Scott. None of them had had contact with Mr. Scott. But what did Officer Vinson know? Officer Vinson was aware that Mr. Scott had a gun in his vehicle. He was aware that he had marijuana in his vehicle. He was aware that when he pinned the car, that Mr. Scott chose to draw that weapon and had it in his hand. He was aware that after repeated commands, Mr. Scott did not obey those commands, acted with aberrant behavior, steps out of the vehicle with gun in hand, doesn't run, doesn't drop the gun, doesn't leave the gun in the car, but steps out and steps back, assessing each officer with a trance-like look described by Officer Vinson. Now, how about Mr. Scott at that point? Well, Officer Vinson did not know Mr. Scott, had not seen him. So unbeknownst to him, Mr. Scott was aware that he was a convicted felon with a gun, an illegal gun, and that he had warrants out from him in Gaston County, and that he had police officers in tactical gear, weapons drawn, surrounding his vehicle. It's at this point that Officer Vinson fired his weapon 4 times, striking Mr. Scott in the wrist, abdomen, and rear shoulder. Despite officers and medical personnel's attempts to render aid, Mr. Scott unfortunately passed away. I'm going to show you a medical examiner, what the medical examiner did for us, and that is what's the correct term, silhouette, a mannequin where the ME put the trajectory of the bullets. Now we know that there were 4 shots because you hear 4 shots in rapid succession on the video. We also know it because Officer Vinson says that he fired. We also know it because there are 4 shell casings that are around in proximity to Officer Vinson. The medical examiner could not tell us the sequence of the projectiles. One in the wrist that we don't show. The one in the wrist is not what we call a clear through and through, because there are pieces of the bullet that are in the wrist. The one in the abdomen goes into the abdomen, and the left side travels through and comes to rest at the spine, at the lower lumbar. The one in the upper shoulder travels from left to right and front to back. Begins at the shoulder, 7 inches from the midline of the back, travels down, through, and ends up at the abdomen at the front part. So there's been much speculation as the first shot being a shot in the back. The totality of the evidence does not come close to supporting that. The medical examiner can't say the sequence of the shootings, but if you look at where Officer Vinson was located, and then you look at the video, we can conclude that one of the shots before the shot in the shoulder was to the abdomen, causing Mr. Scott to keel over, causing a shot after to go through the shoulder and the trajectory that ends up in the front of the abdomen. There's been some speculation in the community regarding whether Mr. Scott was armed. I'd like to address those specific concerns. All of the credible and available evidence suggests that he was in fact armed. Here's the evidence that leads us to that conclusion. Prior to any action being taken, Officer Vincent told Sergeant Pendergraft that he saw Mr. Scott with a gun, and Sergeant Pendergraft relayed that information over the radio. That's the radio traffic you heard a few minutes ago. Every officer present reporting seeing Mr. Scott holding a gun. Officers can be heard on video repeatedly commanding Mr. Scott to drop the gun. The idea that Mr. Scott was unarmed does not explain why officers acted defensively, had their guns drawn, and ordered him to drop the gun. Everyone who has seen the video of the incident can feel the tension in that situation. According to Officer Wiggins, after Mr. Scott was shot, he fell to the ground and his gun landed near his waistline. Officer Wiggins said he moved the gun away from Mr. Scott and stood over the gun to ensure that it could not be accessed by Mr. Scott. On the dash cam video, on the dash camera, and Officer Hutler's body cam, Officer Wiggins is seen crouching down, reaching with one hand, and moving something from Mr. Scott. You do not see the ground. You see Officer Wiggins crouch down, his arm move, and step back, and then stand there. Kind of unusually. Other officers start tending to Mr. Scott, and he is standing there awkwardly. In Mr. Scott's video, you can see an object. In Mrs. Scott's video, you can see an object between his feet in the same place where we see the firearm and body-worn camera footage from another officer who responded to the scene just after the shooting. He stands there. Mrs. Scott, you can see something. You don't know what it is. There's an officer comes up immediately afterwards with body cam. He is going, the officers tell him, clear the car. You can see him going to the cars to look to make sure there's nobody else in it. The cars are clear. And in his body cam, it's clearly depicted officer standing over the gun. Mr. Scott's DNA was found on the slide of the gun and on the grip of the gun. Let me say that again. His DNA was found on the slide of the gun and on the grip of the gun. Mr. Scott's fingerprint was found on the gun when it was examined by Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Crime Lab. However, the state crime lab did not find that print to be of value, meaning they did not find it to be significant enough to be able to say it was Mr. Scott's. Now, there's a reason for that. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department uses a certain technology. They use that technology. They made the determination. When they send it to the State Bureau of Investigation, they send a disc along with a card that is a lower resolution card. The State Bureau of Investigation has different technology. It's like you sending me something to open on some great program you have, and I don't have it, I can't open it. So SBI had to look at the lower resolution, and they found they could not make a determination based on that. Mr. Scott's gun, a Colt 380 semi-automatic, was recovered at the scene. It had one round in a chamber, the safety was off, and the gun was cocked. There's his gun, safety off, cocked, and later examined found a bullet live in the chamber. Investigators traced Mr. Scott's gun, which was stolen from a Gaston County home and then illegally sold to Mr. Scott on September 2nd. The seller admitted that he sold the gun to Mr. Scott, and a Facebook conversation between the seller and a third party corroborates this information. Basically, the seller saw what we all saw on the video of the incident that was being displayed and said, I know that guy, and I know that gun. I'm now going to show you excerpts from that conversation. He's talking to a third party, talking about what he saw on the TV. Through the report that will be released today, you'll be able to read the entire conversation between the seller and a third party. I will never sell another one. The hammer's cocked back. That's the seller. He had an ankle holster. I hope he wiped my prints off of it. Third party, shit, me too. I can get time for that and they would burn me. Third party, I was really hoping it wouldn't be the one, but you know, I'm gonna pray for the best on that for you, cuz. TY, I've learned, means thank you. I'm still hurt. I feel like it's my fault he is dead. The seller also revealed that he sold a holster to Mr. Scott with modifications that matched those found on the holster Mr. Scott was wearing. Here's the holster. He said he sold him the holster. He said he modified it. When he was showing the holster, he says, oh yeah, that's the cuts I made to make sure the gun would fit. The seller went to Gander Mountain with Mr. Scott on the same day he sold it, where Mr. Scott purchased a magazine and ammunition for the firearm. Agents located a computer transaction receipt for the magazine and ammunition, and the purchase was made with a debit card ending in the numbers that matched the debit card found in Mr. Scott's wallet. Text messages from Mr. Scott's phone show that on September 10th, he and the seller communicated about returning or exchanging a clip at Gander Mountain because the one he'd purchased was too short. It wasn't working in the gun. If you see the gun, it doesn't have a clip in it. .380 ammunition was located in Mr. Scott's vehicle inside a pack of cigarettes in the center console cup holder. In the center console, pack of cigarettes. This is them going through the vehicle. You can see the broken glass. Live rounds, .380 to fit the gun. A reading book was not found in the front or back seats of Mr. Scott's SUV. A composition notebook belonging to Mrs. Scott was found wedged between the center console and the front passenger seat. It did not match the description given by witnesses who claimed that they saw Mr. Scott with a book. I'd like to address erroneous claims that someone other than Officer Vinson shot Mr. Scott. First, Officer Vinson took responsibility for the shooting from the outset. Every officer's gun was seized, and an ammunition count was conducted by investigators. Each one had a full complement of ammunition with the exception of Officer Vinson, who was 4 rounds short of a full complement. In the videos, the sound of 4 rounds is clearly heard, and 4 shell casings were recovered at the scene. Each officer is issued a firearm with a unique serial number. Officer Vinson's gun, as well as the 4 shell casings, were sent to the lab for analysis. An expert firearms analyst found that the 4 shell casings were fired from Officer Vinson's gun. 9 civilian witnesses were interviewed by investigators. Some of these witnesses gave conflicting statements, as well as statements that are unsupported by video or physical evidence. 3 of these witnesses claimed on social media or in media interviews that Scott was unarmed, but the SBI later determined they had not actually seen the shooting. When they were interviewed by SBI later, they said they did not actually see the shootings, despite their claims on social media or with the media. One told reporters that she was an eyewitness and saw a white officer shoot Mr. Scott, and that Officer Vinson wasn't around at the time of the shooting. She later acknowledged to the SBI that she heard officers telling Mr. Scott to drop the gun, but she didn't see the shooting. Another told reporters that she saw Mr. Scott with his hands raised, step over a book that fell from his lap. Those statements are refuted by the video evidence, and she later told the SBI that she was in her apartment at the time of the shooting and didn't see Mr. Scott until after the shooting had occurred, and she never saw a book or a gun. A juvenile under the age of 16 told investigators that he saw the incident from his apartment. He initially told Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department that Mr. Scott was reading a book when officers tried to break his window. He said Mr. Scott put the book down and exited the SUV empty-handed with his hands wide open. In a later interview with SBI, he shared that information again and added that officers said they were going to tase Mr. Scott, and he was actually tased by police. He also said the officer did not say anything to Mr. Scott when he exited his vehicle and that a white officer shot him. The physical evidence does not support those claims, and when questioned on some of these issues, this witness referenced someone's claim in a YouTube video, and it became apparent that he had incorporated information that he'd heard from other sources. Investigators also went to his home to examine his vantage point, and what they discovered is that it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to make those observations due to the obstruction of a tree and the positioning of Mr. Scott's SUV. Basically, from his apartment, there's a tree, and there's the passenger side of Mr. Scott's vehicle. He would have to see through the tree and through the passenger side to see anything occurring on the other side of the vehicle. Two witnesses said they were inside a nearby home and watched the incident unfold. They heard the officer's commands to drop the gun. Both indicated they saw something in Mr. Scott's hand, but they could not identify the object. They had a view, but because of their distance, they say that he had something in his hand, but they can't say what was in his hand. Another witness was working in the area, heard the officer's shouts, but had turned away when the shots were fired. Now, Mrs. Scott has maintained that her husband was unarmed during the encounter. It's important to understand that we must consider her statements and weigh them along with all of the other evidence in this case. Charlotte-Mecklenburg detectives began to interview Mrs. Scott at the hospital on the evening of the shooting, but she ultimately terminated that interview on the advice of her attorney. She and her attorneys later publicly claimed that CMPD never attempted to interview her. Before that interview ended, she told CMPD that 4 white officers were present. All 4 fired their weapons, and there were no black officer present. The brief interview was captured on a body-worn camera. Later in the interview with CBS News, she stated that Officer Vincent, who is black, was present, but she did not believe he shot Mrs. Scott, or she did not believe he shot her husband, Mr. Scott, because he was not part of the action. Mrs. Scott did later meet with the SBI for an interview, and she provided valuable information about her husband's medications and their effects. She said that Mr. Scott had just taken his medicine and that those prescriptions make him zoned. Mrs. Scott has maintained in interviews with investigators and the media that Mr. Scott did not have a gun. She told the SBI that the last time she ever knew Scott to have any type of firearm was prior to his wreck in October of 2015, and that she was certain he did not have any guns after January of 2016. However, text messages between Mr. and Mrs. Scott the month before the shooting include an argument about a gun in Mr. Scott's possession. In the report that we're putting online, you'll find limited information regarding Mr. Scott's background and medical history. While he had a criminal history and was receiving treatment for psychiatric disorders, his history was unknown to Officer Vincent. In this case, it would be merely speculative to assess whether this history explained Mr. Scott's conduct on the day of the incident. In conclusion, after a thorough review and given the totality of the circumstances and credible evidence in this case, it is my opinion that Officer Vincent acted lawfully when he shot Mr. Scott. He acted lawfully. I am fully satisfied and entirely convinced that Officer Vincent's use of deadly force was lawful. The central issue here is whether Officer Vincent was lawful in using deadly force against Mr. Scott. Anyone is justified in using deadly force if he reasonably believed, and in fact believed, that he or someone else was in imminent danger of great bodily injury or death. We cannot know what Mr. Scott's intentions or reasoning were that day, and Officer Vincent could not know that at the time. What he saw was a man who had drawn a gun when confronted by police, exited a vehicle with a gun in hand, and failed to comply with officers who commanded him at least 10 times to put the gun down. When considering imminent threat, it's important to consider the science of response time and reaction time. The reality is that Mr. Scott could have raised his gun and killed Officer Vincent or another officer before any of them could have reacted to the threat. Reaction time studies dealing with the police shootings provide valuable insight for the analysis of this shooting, and these studies are cited in the report. Those studies show that in these scenarios, the result is a tie at best. Even officers in a position of ready, watching somebody, if they're armed with a gun to their side, by the time they do this, the reaction from officers has to be from the brain to the trigger finger, and the studies say it is tie at best. When considering, I think there's a misconception out there about the scope of the review in the DA's office. This office does not examine whether an officer followed CMPD directives or policies or whether the incident was handled appropriately from a tactical standpoint. In this case, the only determination this office is making is whether or not Officer Vincent acted in self-defense. Now I'd like to speak to the community. I know that some out there are going to be frustrated. I want everyone in this community to know that we meticulously, thoroughly reviewed all of the evidence in this case, made sure it was credible evidence in order to make the decision that we made today. We took a lot of painstaking effort to make certain that there was no personal bias in the review, and public opinion did not factor in our determination. I'd like the community to take a collective pause. The community should read the report, digest the report. Please do not act viscerally on news snippets. Read the report. In describing the legal analysis and the basis for the decision, in this case, my office and I unfortunately find ourselves in a position of correcting misinformation that has been shared both on social media and in the news media. People made claims on camera but later admitted to law enforcement that they didn't actually see the incident. People in the public might then ask themselves, why didn't you release more information to refute these untrue statements? I have always asserted that my office would strive towards transparency, but I need people to understand that among my highest priorities is also protecting the integrity of every investigation. That means responsible transparency. Responsible transparency. In an ongoing investigation, details are closely guarded to help measure the truthfulness of witnesses and, should someone be charged, preserve the defendant's right to fair trial. I know the lack of accurate information is frustrating to the public and the media that operates on a 24-hour news cycle. But in this age of instant media and the impulse to immediately form an opinion, I'm asking that as we move forward, we remind ourselves that in these cases, we should not jump to conclusions until we have all of the facts. In the days that followed Mr. Scott's death, we watched as long simmering frustrations boiled over. I heard observers say, this is not Charlotte. This is not the city that we love. But it is. This is Charlotte. This is where our friends families, neighbors, and colleagues felt so passionate that they marched on our streets to call for change. Let me be clear. I have not and will not condone violence or property damage as a means of expression. But the fact that criminal charges are not appropriate under the law in this particular case does not mean we can dismiss the concerns expressed by those who raise their voices to raise the consciousness of this community. I think it's high time that all of us recognize that this is Charlotte, and not everyone experiences the same Charlotte. Throughout our entire justice system, people should have the same experience. The people of Mecklenburg County deserve the confidence that every case is handled with fairness and equity. I want this community to know that I would not hesitate to prosecute an officer whom evidence showed acted outside of the law. And in fact, we have. From assaults to DWIs to fraud to, unfortunately, sexual offenses. We have prosecuted officers. It is my sincere prayer that no one is ever killed by police. But I also pray that police are never placed in a position of having to make the decision to use lethal force to protect themselves or innocent lives around them. I welcome being part of the ongoing public discussion and exchange of ideas on how to improve our system so that all community members have complete confidence that they will be dealt with fairly and treated with respect. Justice demands nothing less. At this time, I'll take questions.
Murray, do you have information on specific time dedication Mr. Scott is taking?
We do.
You just saw a live news conference held by the Charlotte DA. And